Hello, and welcome to another video from your friends at the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. Today, we're pleased to welcome another research team from our Learning from Elections project. We have Christopher Mann, who is an associate professor of political science at Skidmore College, and Katie Searles, who is associate professor of political communication and of political science at Louisiana State University. Thank you both so much for being here. Now that those brief introductions are over, I'm going to turn everything over to the lab's director, Charles Stewart. Charles, take it away.
Thanks, Claire, and it's a great privilege and delight to have both Chris and Katie on the call today, or on the Zoom today, as we talk about their research in political communication, and particularly as it relates to how press coverage affects what voters see and how they kind of interpret the voting process. And so let's just jump into it. And before we talk about specific research, Chris and Katie, that y'all have done, I think it might be good just to step back a little bit and talk about the topic in general that has to do with, a lot of your research has to do with visuals in communications and communicating about politics. And so just to start, where does that interest come from? And so where does that interest come from, and how does it relate to what we'll be talking about today? Chris.
So this project really comes out of a lot of work on lines, some of it with Medsel, and a very large project with a couple dozen universities around the country gathering information and starting to notice when the news media talked about it, and realizing that for a lot of people, they're getting their information about this topic that we're studying and the way elections are run from the news media. That's where people's information comes from. I roped Katie into this project in a hallway outside of a coffee shop at the American Political Science Association conference. She's a former colleague of mine when I also taught at LSU and worked in the political communication program, where we were dealing with this a lot, this question of how people perceive various aspects of politics via the lens of the news media. And if I remember the question or the conversation correctly, Katie was a little skeptical that there wasn't coverage of how elections run and things like lines. We just didn't know anything about it in political science or communication. It was a topic that had been overlooked. And so I hadn't found anything. Katie didn't find anything. And we decided that this is a big hole in our understanding of the way the public deals with elections. We just didn't know what the information was that they were getting about how elections were conducted, voting, voter registration, and this topic of lines that was top of mind for me, based on other research about, was that impacting whether people were going to vote, whether they thought elections were well run, whether that transferred on to other attitudes about their faith in democratic politics.
So that's a great overview of the issue. Now, in particular, one of the things that I hope we can talk about today is some specific research that was reflected in a blog post that y'all did in Mann Lab, I guess right before the 2022 election, specifically about line lengths and the coverage of long lines on election day. Katie, you want to talk about what the research, the specific research was there, what you were trying to accomplish, and what you found?
Sure. So that project, the Lines project, as we call it, the one that is best embodied in the Mann Lab piece, is basically interested in this pretty basic question, which is, what happens when people learn of lines at their polling place? And I think one of the things that we really often take for granted in this work is the primary way people learn of politics is from the news. And I kind of always have to remind people of that, right? That the news, for better or for worse, is still the primary way people learn of what's going on in their communities. And when it comes to voting day, one of the things we care a lot about is how people are learning about what's going on at their polling place, where to vote, all the logistics, etc. One of the key components of that type of coverage is just covering whether or not there are long lines. And one of the reasons we became really interested in lines in terms of like the visual is because if you think about television news coverage, it, because of the medium, requires an image. And one of the more compelling images are like long lines, right? For better or for worse. There's not a whole lot of compelling imagery when you're talking about like showing up at a polling place, but lines and the humanity of it, that's great, right? But is it great for the public? Is it great for the perception of the community in terms of how their polling places are being run, how the election administration is going in their local area? So we wanted to know that, right? We wanted to know what the effects were. So we ran a couple of experiments, really way too many, but they're all really clear about what they find. And that is that when people see news coverage of elections that focuses on imagery that uses long lines at their polling place, they are less likely to vote. They are less likely to think the elections are well run, and they're more likely to think that they will have to wait in a long line in the next election. So you can imagine that there are really important consequences to showing coverage that features long line imagery because of these sort of effects.
So can you talk about kind of what the experiments that you ran were, and kind of what, is it like if people see people see the image and they just don't show up? Is it, I always like to know, is it a big number? Is it a small number? And kind of how do we think about these effects? I mean, these are experiments. And so, how do we think about the applicability of experiments in this setting? And kind of what are the range of the effects that you all got from the experiments?
Sure, they're consistent across, the television experiment is consistent across 2 surveys. And we find that 5% of folks are less likely to want to vote in the future when they see a television clip that talks about voting day that features a long line image, relative to the control group that sees a television clip that talks about voting but does not show a long line image in the clip. So 5% are less likely to vote in future elections, 6% are less likely to think that their elections are well run. And then I will read this to make sure I get it right. It increased the share of people who expected wait times longer than 30 minutes in their community by 14 percentage points. And many of those people actually thought that they would be waiting longer than 2 hours just from watching a clip that had an image of a long line. And so because it's an experiment, everything's the same except for that image of the long line. And again, the results are really similar when we use across the 2 experiments with the treatment that's a video. But we also did this because Chris and I are nothing if not data hounds. We also did this with a text treatment where it was more of a print article and there was just an embedded image. And either you got an article about voting day that had an image of lines, or you got an article about voting day that just had a voting booth. And people that saw the image, again, the article with the image of lines, were also less likely to want to vote in the future, more likely to think lines are going to be long, and more likely to think that their elections were poorly run in that area.
Yeah, so and just to remind folks, I oftentimes talk about kind of research in this area, meaning election administration, election science, where in almost every intervention, whether it's a experiment or whether it's an observational study, I always like to quip, well, it's like the 1 or 2% effect. Like everything like moves the needle like just a couple of points. And so when you're talking about even in the experiment, and there's the classic issues of external validity, that if you get 4 percentage points, 5 percentage points, 14 percentage points, that suggests that there's something there that actually might be more consequential than a lot of the other aspects in this space that get a lot of the headlines, like changes to voting policy, et cetera. And these are immediate visceral effects, right? This is election day, and or they simulated election day. People are trying to figure out how they're going to spend their day, and then potentially, boom, there's a picture of long lines, and I'm going to make a decision based on that. So I mean, based on that, so Chris, I mean, what are the takeaways here? We like to support. I mean, we are political scientists. Most of this research in this project is political scientists, and we're curiosity driven, but we're also in this overall program interested in kind of news you can use, research you can use, and there's implications here. And so, what do we take away from this in terms of what, say, journalists should be doing, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, this was very much our intention. We were very mindful of the journalist audience. The blog post you referenced for Nieman Lab, that is a newsletter that goes out to a largely journalism, practicing journalists and folks in that community. And we were really trying to speak to them to say, look, you have a choice. You have a choice about the images that you choose on election day. And we want them to be mindful of that choice. If there are long lines, that is news. But, don't go to the default of we're going to drive around the entire county looking for the one polling place with lines and make that be the image, because that is, potentially detrimental, and there's not a lot of news value. I mean, there's always going to be one polling place out of hundreds where the power goes out, or somebody burns the popcorn in the microwave and the fire alarm goes off, or, life happens. I do want to say one thing about this, to be clear. You're talking about whether these results are what we would see in the real world. These treatments that we developed, the newspaper story was an actual newspaper story, that we tweaked a little bit just so it was generic. And then we just swapped out images that were into actual newspaper stories. The TV news stories that we showed people in the experiment were using actual news footage that we found and edited together. So this is not us making up what we think journalists are doing. This is us drawing on what's happening in the real world. And another part of this project is actually looking at how frequently these kinds of coverage occur. So we're not testing things that are sort of abstract. These are really choices that journalists are making, and we hope to be able to, shape those choices, but also to think about other communicators, right? Whether that's election officials talking about long lines or short lines, especially during early voting, where people have a choice of where to vote. We're seeing more election officials post, this one has a long line, this one has a short line. That might not be great if the lines are all long in places. If lines are short everywhere, that's probably encouraging participation. But putting up Facebook posts that say lines are really long at early voting right now, maybe that just shifts people for early voting, but I would have concerns about it on election day. So there's some cautionary tales there. And as I said, another piece of this project is trying to collect information about both news coverage and newspaper coverage of the voting process. And to just document, first of all, how much attention the news media does pay. And then through these experiments and other pieces, to try to start to understand the impact on the way that people perceive elections and make decisions about elections, as well as their long-term implications. Do they trust the election? Do they then trust the people who are elected in those elections? This is not just about what happens in and around election day, but the way in which elections become the foundation of democracy. And if people don't have positive understandings of what happens on election day and in the voting process, then that may have implications farther down the line.
Yeah, I mean, this brings to mind kind of the nature. Again, y'all are studying the nature of the news process, and there's the old saw about it's man bites dog that gets in the news. And to be very clear about what we know about long lines is even say in the 2012 election, where long lines gave rise to an entire presidential commission, that only somewhere around 5 to 10% of Americans, even in that election, waited more than 30 minutes to vote, and the vast majority of Americans waited no time to vote. And so we are, maybe this evolution has made us overweight the long tail of distributions, but the actual news on election day is that people are almost everywhere are voting without problems, and that we tend to overweight the problems that we hear about and then apply them to our situation. And it's a very important corrective, it seems to me, both for journalists and for election officials as they think about their communications with the voters. And that's why I like this research so much. I think it's so intellectually interesting, but it's also, as I said, news you can use. And so we like that. As we wrap up here, is there anything else that we want to tell our millions of viewers about the research that you're doing, other topics that you'd like to take on before we sign off here?
So we talked a lot about the Lines project because that's the part that we've been most thorough about. But there are other aspects. So there's the broader cataloging of the different types of coverage, which we hope will spark both our own research and research by others. But we're also doing experiments on a number of other topics. So one of them is how the news coverage portrays the progression of the vote count, a topic that, Charles, you are quite familiar with, right? As it evolves on election night and then after election night and the way in which different frames might influence it. Another that we're digging into and have the last of our set of experiments that's going out, another round of it, is related to the way the news media covers the legal controversies around election and election processes. When there are challenges, we've looked at immediately around election day. Now we're going to look at other kinds of legal challenges to see how that shapes people's perception of the election. So engaging with scholars who study the way the judiciary is perceived, as well as the election process, to think about how this is all having, the change in the way we think about elections, which for years was not very interesting to many people and is now moved to the center of public discourse, and how that might shape attitudes.
Katie, you get the last word. Anything to add?
Well, basically, just Chris and I are really excited to continue to probe this question of how does the news communicate out election administration processes in ways that matter for the public, and how can we use this knowledge to better understand how election officials, but also journalists and others can talk to each other about these very important things, these things that really affect our democracy. And we're really grateful to Medsel for supporting the work so we can continue to do it.
Well, we're delighted to support the work because of both the quality and the applicability to what's happening right now. So thanks very much for the work, and we look forward to seeing more things come out of this project, and we'll be covering that as well. So with that said, back to you, Claire.
Great. And as Charles said, thanks to both of you for joining us today. Really looking forward to seeing more of this project as it goes forward. Thanks also to everyone watching. If you'd like to learn more about the research that we discussed today, there will be links in the description box below. If you'd like to be notified about future videos, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And until next time, keep talking elections.